viewers, my name is Renee Bishop. I'm from the BCM district in the Eastern Cape, and I'm a subject advisor for life sciences. Welcome to the ECDOE broadcast studio. Today's lesson is on the scientific investigation. Now, the scientific investigation is an important part of life sciences that is covered in both paper 1 and paper 2. It is also covered from grade 10 to grade 12. In today's lesson, we'll be looking at 10 common questions that are found in both papers. For this investigation, you are going to need 3 past papers. The first paper is the Eastern Cape Trial Paper 1 from 2024. Then you will also need the NSC November Paper 1 from 2024 and the NSC November Paper 2 from 2024. Let's look at the layout of a scientific investigation. Scientific investigations have a very structured layout. Firstly, they always have an introduction. The introduction explains the purpose of the investigation. All right. It also contains the aim, which is the most important part of any investigation, as it gives you both the independent and dependent variable. The second part of a scientific investigation is your procedure. Your procedure is how the investigation is done, and it contains the planning, the steps taken for validity and reliability. Lastly, we have the results, which are usually in the form of a graph or a table, but may also be in the form of a diagram. The results will give us the relationship between the independent variable and the measured dependent variable. We are going to look at the 10 most commonly asked questions in scientific investigation. Remember, however, that you still need to also learn how to draw graphs, how to create tables, all right, and also calculations. Let's get on with today's lesson. The first question that we are going to look at is the aim. The aim of the investigation always starts with to investigate or to determine. Always highlight or underline the aim when you read through the stem of the investigation. In this investigation, in the Eastern Cape Trial Paper 1, we see that the aim of the investigation was to investigate the effect of microplastic bioaccumulation on male fertility in rats. Once you have highlighted or underlined the aim, the next thing to do is to circle the 2 factors or variables represented in the aim. Right? So in this aim, the 2 factors are microplastic bioaccumulation and male fertility in rats. This is your independent and dependent variable. Now let's decide which one is independent and which one is dependent. The independent variable is the variable that we can change or manipulating. It is the one that is investigated by the scientist. In this investigation, in the trial paper 1, we see that the independent variable is microplastic bioaccumulation. Now, when we write this in an exam, we do not write the effect of microplastic bioaccumulation. Right? That is part of the aim. The independent variable is just microplastic bioaccumulation. The dependent variable is the variable that we are measuring in this investigation. Now it's your turn to practice. You're going to need the November 2021 and the November 2022 papers from 2024. We are going to use question 3.5 from paper 1 and question 3.3 from paper 2. In both these papers, I want you to firstly find the aim, highlight it and underline it. Secondly, circle the 2 variables and then decide which one is independent and which one is dependent. Press pause while you do this. Welcome back. So let's look at your answers. In paper 1, the aim was to determine the effect of auxin on plant tropism. Your dependent variable was auxin, while your independent variable was plant tropisms. In paper 2, your aim was to determine the influence on the type of milk on the height of children drinking the milk. The independent variable was the type of milk that we used in the investigation. That is what the scientists were investigating. The dependent variable was the height of the children drinking the milk. Remember to please always write the full dependent variable out. Don't take shortcuts in life sciences, otherwise you may lose marks. Let's go on now to question number 2C. How is the dependent variable measured? Now, sometimes it is not possible to measure the dependent variable directly, and we need to measure the dependent variable in a different way. So let's look at this investigation in front of us. In this investigation, the aim of the investigation was to determine the influence of temperature on the growth of chickens. We can determine that temperature is our independent variable and the growth of chickens is our dependent variable. Now, if we want to measure the growth of chickens, we can't just look at a chicken and determine what its growth is. We have to measure it in some way. So in this investigation, if we look at the table that they made, we see that they measured the growth of the chicken, right, using the average mass of the chicken. So we used average mass of the chicken to show its growth. In other words, if we are asked the question, how was the dependent variable measured? Our answer would be the average mass of the chicken. Let's have a look at the same question in our Eastern Cape trial paper from 2024. In this question, all right, the dependent variable was male fertility in rats. We cannot measure male fertility directly, and therefore we need to find a way of measuring male fertility. If we look at the table in this investigation, we see that instead of measuring male fertility directly, they used testosterone level to measure male fertility. So our answer to the question, how was the dependent variable measured? It was measured by taking the testosterone level. Now, the testosterone level is not the only way to measure male fertility. We can also measure male fertility by taking sperm count. But in this investigation, scientists decided to use testosterone level as their way to measure male fertility. We also look at the controlled variables. Now, the controlled variables are those variables that must be kept the same during the investigation. For a good investigation, only the dependent and the independent variable must change during the investigation. All other variables must be kept the same. So let's look at our trial paper from 2024 and let's look at what scientists controlled during this investigation. If we look at this investigation, the first thing that they controlled was the species of the rats that they used. They were all albino Wistar species. The second thing that they controlled was that they were all healthy. They were healthy individuals and they were all fed the same diet. Also, we conducted this investigation for the same period of 90 days. And each group was tested every 30 days by the scientists. All these variables were controlled. Now, you may notice that I did not add males were controlled to my list of controlled variables, okay? The investigation is about male rats, so we don't need to control males or gender during this investigation because we can only do this investigation on male rats. Now it's your turn to practice. Using your November paper 1 for 2024, write down 2 controlled variables from that investigation. We'll be back now. Okay, let's see how you got that right. Okay, so the variables that were controlled in this investigation were number one, the species, right? They were all the same species of plant. Number two, the amount of light was controlled because all plants were kept in darkness. And number three, the duration that they were kept in darkness was controlled, right? They were all kept in darkness for 72 hours. Hope you got those right. Okay, the next question is question 3. The planning steps of the investigation. And I like to use the acronym ELMD. E stands for ethical issues. We need to plan for ethical issues. And the most important one is to get permission from relative authorities. We know today that the POPI Act is very, very important, and we cannot just use people's information for our own needs. So it's very important for you to get permission from relevant authorities when you do investigations on on animals and people, right? So when we do an investigation on animals, we will usually get permission from a vet or a scientist that is studying animals to ensure that we are not harming the animals in any way. When we do investigations on humans, we need to get permissions from them. If we do investigation on children, we need to get parents' permission to use their information. Right? When we do an investigation on plants, however, we don't need any permission at all. So this planning step is not needed when doing an investigation on plants. The next planning steps involve logistics. Okay? That means how you do that and the management of the investigation. So firstly, you need to decide on the sample size. You don't want your sample size to be too small, because if your sample size is too small, in other words, you use one sample, then it's not going to be reliable. Also, you don't want your sample size to be too big, because you might not be able to manage that number of samples in your investigation. You also need to decide on a length of time. Now, not all investigations are based on time. Some investigations is when we do the investigation and we finish it, while other investigations might be based on a length of time. So this planning step will only be needed if the investigation is based on a length of time. The next planning step is the method or procedure that we will use. Firstly, we will need to decide how to measure the dependent variable. If our dependent variable is not directly measurable, then we need to work out how are we going to measure that dependent variable. We also need to plan how we are going to manage our data. We need to decide how we're going to record the data. For instance, are we going to take a table, or are we going to do it in a graph, or am I going to use diagrams to record my data? I will also need to collect all the equipment needed for this investigation. Not all investigations require equipment, so this planning step is only useful in investigations that have equipment that will be needed. Let's have a look at our trial paper from 2024 to see what planning steps were needed in this investigation. So firstly, this investigation was done on male rats, which are animals. So therefore, I would need to get permission from the relevant authorities. Also, I needed to decide on the sample size. In this investigation, the scientists decided to use 20 rats per group. In other words, 60 rats in total. They needed to decide on that size of the sample. They also needed to decide on the length of time to run this investigation. They decided to run this investigation over a period of 90 days. They also decided how they are going to measure the dependent variable. Remember, in this investigation, your dependent variable was male fertility in rats. And they decided to measure it using testosterone level. We also needed to decide how to record this data. From looking at this investigation, the scientists decided to record this data in a table, right, where they recorded the amount of microplastics plus the testosterone levels over the period of 90 days. And lastly, scientists needed to collect the equipment for this investigation. They needed to have the equipment with which to measure the amount of testosterone that is in the rat's blood. Right, now it's over to you. Your turn. Let's look at our paper 1 and paper 2 from November 2024 once again. This time, I want you to name the planning steps that are needed for these investigations. Right, and we'll be back now. Welcome back. All right, so let's see if you got this right. For the first paper, in paper 1, what planning steps are going to be relevant? Firstly, getting permission is irrelevant for this question because we are investigating plants. Therefore, only the following steps are relevant. Deciding on how many plants to use, deciding the length of time to keep the plants in darkness, deciding on how to record the data, and collecting equipment that is needed. For instance, in this investigation, they needed to make agar jelly, all right, with and without auxins so that they had it for the investigation. Now notice, when I'm writing the planning steps, I'm not writing them in a generic way that I learned. I'm writing them according to how the investigation was done. So instead of saying decide on the sample size, I said decide on how many plants to use because my sample in this investigation are plants. Instead of saying decide on the length of time, I said decide on the length of time to keep the plants in darkness because that was what I was investigating. So when you're answering scientific investigation questions, always make sure that you're making it relevant to the investigation that is being done. In the November 2024 paper 2, all right, all our planning steps were relevant. So we had to get permission first of all. We needed to decide how many children to use. We needed to decide on the length of time to conduct the investigation, which was 7 years. They needed to decide how to record the data. They needed to also collect equipment. Now, I've only given you 5 planning steps, but there are many more planning steps that need to be taken. So you will have noticed that I've only given you 5 planning steps in this investigation, but there are many, many more planning steps that were taken to prepare for this investigation. If you look at the memo for the November paper 2, 2024 paper, you will see that they listed a long list of planning steps that were accepted. So there are many more planning steps, but we are going to concentrate on the 5 most important steps. Right, let's look at question 4 now. The relationship. We need to often explain the relationship shown in the results. Now, the relationship would be between the independent and the measure-dependent variable in the results. Now, if we are looking at the relationship in the results, we need to look at the table because the table is where the results are being represented. Okay? Now, where do we find the results in our investigation? The results in our investigation are found in the table. Okay? And this is where we're going to look to see the relationship of the variables. So if we look at the trial paper for 2024, we see that this table is showing us that there were 3 groups. Group 1 had no microplastics in their water. Group 2 had 4 micrometers of plastic per liter, and group 3 had 10 micrometers of plastic per liter. So we see that there's an increase in microplastics in the water. Right. We also see that the amount of testosterone that is measured in the first group, it stayed relatively constant. In the second group, the testosterone level dropped. And the third group that had the most microplastics, the amount of testosterone dropped drastically. So what is this table telling us? It's telling us that as the amount of microplastics increases, the testosterone level is decreasing. Therefore, the relationship that is shown in this table is the increase in microplastic bioaccumulation causes a decrease in testosterone level. Okay. Now, sometimes they ask you to explain the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. In this investigation, my dependent variable was male fertility in rats. And remember, I measured the dependent variable using the testosterone level. So if my question is asking me to explain the relationship between independent and dependent, I therefore need to use microplastic bioaccumulation and male fertility in rats in my explanation. Therefore, my answer will change. It will no longer be the increase in microplastic bioaccumulation causes a decrease in testosterone. It will be the increase in microplastic bioaccumulation causes a decrease in male fertility levels in rats. Okay, you see that now I have used the dependent variable in my answer because my question asked me to compare independent and dependent. Okay. Let's look at the previous slide, how different that was. In this question, it asked me to show the relationship, all right, in the results. So I looked at my table and I explained using the words in my table. But in the next question, it asked me to explain the relationship between independent and dependent. And therefore, I needed to use the words for independent and dependent. Okay. So it's very important to read the question carefully and so that you explain the correct relationship that's being shown. Right, so time for you now to practice that. Looking at the November paper 2 for 2024, describe the relationship shown in the results. Right, let's see what you got. Okay, the relationship that is shown in results says that drinking cow's milk has a greater average height than children drinking soy milk. Right, that is what the table is showing us. I hope you got that one correct. Question 5 now. Write a conclusion. Okay, this one is often asked in our exams, and often learners are getting it wrong because they are using the wrong wording. Remember that your conclusion must always answer your aim. In other words, your conclusion must have the same words, the same variables that are mentioned in your aim. Do not write directly proportional when explaining the relationship. I know in some other subjects, all right, when we're writing a conclusion, the term directly proportional is accepted. But in life sciences, it's not accepted. We need to explain how the independent variable is affecting the dependent variable. So let's look at this paper, the trial paper from 2024. Okay, in this paper, all right, remember that my independent variable was microplastic bioaccumulation, and my dependent variable was male fertility in rats. Now, I saw from my table that as the microplastics increased, okay, the microplastic bioaccumulation increased, the testosterone level decreased. So how does this affect male fertility? Well, as the increase in microplastic bioaccumulation occurred, it caused a decrease in male fertility in rats. Okay, so let's read that again. The increase in microplastic bioaccumulation causes a decrease in male fertility in rats. So remember, we cannot use testosterone level when writing our conclusion because testosterone level is not the dependent variable. Our dependent variable is male fertility in rats, and therefore we need to use that when writing our conclusion. Right, over to you again. Okay, using November paper 2, 2024, you are now going to write the conclusion for that investigation. Right, so now we're back. Let's see if you got your conclusion right. Remember, this investigation was about the type of milk that the child is drinking versus the height of the child, the average height. Okay, so our conclusion, we may say in different ways. Okay, the first way we can say our conclusion is cow's milk consumption leads to better growth or increased height compared to soya milk. You also may say soya milk consumption by children leads to decreased height or below average height. Or cow's milk consumption by children leads to increased height or above average height. Okay? So when we are writing, right, markers do accept different versions, all right, as long as we have the independent and dependent variables stated in our conclusion, and it is showing the relationship between the dependent and independent variable. In other words, how they are affecting each other. So we've come to the end of part 1 on the scientific investigation. Keep an eye out for part 2 on our channel, and thank you for staying and watching till the end of this recording. We have come to the end of this lesson. You can leave your questions on the comments. Don't forget to leave your school's name so we can give you shout outs. Please share, recommend, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you for watching. See you soon on our next lesson. Bye.